Yeah, I'm learning all this too. So I went from Chevy to Ford.
There we go.
A Chevy man. Well, I'm convinced. I had to go on the other side of the fence. They said
So you've seen the light.
Yeah, they said the grass. You think the grass is greener on the other side. Yes, it's even greener and it's higher.
And it's higher too. Okay.
So I learned. I'm still learning. I still know my Chevy stuff. Yeah, this Ford stuff is a little complicated, but it's lessons.
Yeah, there we go. Then check the pump. Oh, it is. It is. I see that. Good. Today we'll talk about the 351 Cleveland and of course the Boss 302. That's basically the same cylinder head with just one minor detail that you have to look at to differentiate a Boss 302 69 head or 70 as opposed to a 4V Cleveland. And a lot of people, you know, I guess don't realize that, because what I have here is a very rare Boss 302 casting, and I'll show you why we can differentiate that from a 4V closed chamber head. The Boss 302 is also closed chamber, and we'll go through with the open chamber 2V, how to identify it, and of course the open chamber 4V, and we'll highlight the differences and advantages, disadvantages, and I have a surprise that as far as the 2V is concerned. All right, and it happened years ago. But anyway, any further information that you seem to have not gotten from this video, I suggest that you look at Drag Boss Garage with my friend Tim Halstead. He's basically a Cleveland historian. He's talked about to just about all the hardcore racing guys in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that has ran the Clevelands, and he's got a very good insight that I don't think anybody really has covered as much as he has done. And kudos, credit to him. Very impressive background as far as all the details, modifying, production casting, all this stuff has been done. I race Fords, but at this level that he has researched. All right, so anyway, here we go, let's start. Oh, before I go through this whole deal about the Cleveland, let's put some history behind it. The 69 Boss 302 came out for the purpose of competing in the Trans Am Series, which after forced success with the ultra rare Tunnel Port 302, they decided that flow is indeed the answer to power. That's what they believed back then. I don't think they really thought about, you know, swirl and tumble, you know, and port recovery. I think I don't think very much that they had that in mind. But it's basically one-dimensional flow. The more flow, the better off it's going to be. And it took a long time for that to, you know, be taken off the psyche of the engine builder. In fact, when I went to an advanced engineering conference years ago, and one guy who is a newbie in that group, he comes in and first thing his comment was, "How much did that engine flow?" And everybody started busting up, because you could just tell with that kind of a question where he's coming from, where he's been, and where he's headed. It wasn't all about flow. Chamber was already in play, all right, swirl and tumble, all those quench, all those things. I think this guy had no idea. I think all you got to do is put some big cylinder heads in it and off you go, all right? So that was one of the old belief back then, just like porting and polishing. polish that intake port till it really looks like you know, a mirror. That's supposed to be the best. But anyway, this thing's changed. But here you go. 69, 70, the Cleveland came out with a 2V and the 4V. And you can tell the 2V from the 4V when you're looking at the engine. There's a tag on the corner of the valve cover rail. It says 2 or 4. The difference between the 4 tagged head is it an open chamber or is it a closed chamber, 4 barrel heads. And interestingly, I know of one guy before, I don't know if I should quote his name, but he held NHRA H Stock A automatic class record for that time a small block. I think that's where the small block Chevys and Fords ended up at, in NHRA class or classification, H Stock A or H Stock, basically 4-speed. And he called me up about some heads. He said, hey, he goes, I heard you got some 2-barrel Cleveland. I was like, yeah, in fact I do. He said, hey, could I buy it off you? And I said, who's this? It sounds familiar. He goes, it's so-and-so. I go, okay. He holds the record for H Stock A. And you've heard me say before, closed chamber, superior, so forth, so on, because of, you know, the combustion efficiencies of a closed chamber as opposed to an open chamber, and how it tend to tolerate more of the gasoline. Octane rating might be a little bit on the low side, and the closed chamber will tolerate a lot more ignition timing as opposed to the 2V. You have to really back it down because they ping, all right, and rather easily compared to a 4V chamber because they don't have that mixture motion when the piston comes up to TDC and basically, bam, smack all the air and fuel and stir them up to be more homogeneous or a little easier to light up. All right, so at that point in time, I think when they designed these things, I don't even think that they were thinking of tumble and swirl motion at that particular time. But very many people like Smokey and Nick, and of course other guys out there that has run this system, seen the benefits of quench. And like Smokey and Nick said before, if you smack the piston to the head, that's when you're gonna make more power. And it's not really contact, but if you shadow that combustion chamber with the piston, you can take off the heads, and some of these pictures that I have, it shows the combustion chamber shape right at the top of the piston. It's amazing, and that's when you know you're squeezing it right, not nitrous, okay, but squeezing the mixture right and creating a combustible mixture. But there you go. So the Boss 302 came with a 219 valve, and I think 69 came with a 224. All right, that's big. That's big block Chevy and a 302, and 219 later on the preceding years. That's why when you look at Arlen Fatally, Mike Edwards, so many people back then that run, Don Bowles ran a super modified Fairmont, and the other guys are all Mavericks. When you look at these guys are duking it out with big blocks in the same class, you know, because it's all about breathing at that point. And Pro Stock, the Cleveland was basically penalized with more weight per cubic inch than any other engines, to the point that later on the competition decided that they will not run the small block Chevy anymore because they just won't keep up. Even Rahar Morrison even made those statements, and the only way they could keep up with Bob Glidden at that point in time, Jack Roush and Dino Don and all the other guys, I think they decided, no, I did not think, they decided that they have to run a canted valve engine, and because of the advantages of canted valve, therefore Glidden, the rest of the Ford boys are running these stroke 351 Clevelands, and for the super modified classes they're doing a stroker 302. All right, but for Pro Stock it's a D-stroke, I think 331 or 327, 325. Tim Halstead would know more about the cubic inches that day. Glidden and the rest of the Cleveland gang has ran on NHRA, and they keep getting penalized. All right, and same thing in NASCAR. They were handicapped big time as well. But here you go. Therefore, when eventually Raher Morrison, you know, all the other guys, Sonny Bryant, whatever, all the NHRA guys decided to go with a big block. Same thing, D-stroke. I had a 9-inch deck 454 back then in the shop. I don't even know where that block went already. Somebody's doorstop perhaps, but I still have the cylinder heads. And the amazing part was that they D-stroke, all right, to get the RPMs up, just like the Cleveland guys or the Ford guys also D-stroke their small block and bring the RPMs up, or the RPM potential. But the biggest handicap for the for the big block Chevy was the uneven left and right side port. And there's no way you can tune to peak when one set of 4 doing something else and the other 4 are doing another thing. All right, they don't quite peak at the same amount. With the Cleveland, with a symmetrical port, they all reach their peak basically at the same time. All right, but when you have the left and right side port, like on the big block Chevy, there are 2 torque peaks, because the shorter port will peak higher, and then the longer port, you know, will basically peak at a lower RPM, so you can't quite get it right. Okay, 4 is asking one thing and the other 4 is doing another thing. So today, all the big block Chevys, of course the Fords and the Chrysler, are all running symmetrical intake and exhaust ports. All right, so that is pretty much a legacy of what they found out years and years ago in NHI Pro Stock. And at the time I was in high school, Hollywood High, I remember, you know, with my Torino, I had a 351 Windsor, and I remember a friend of mine was laughing at me because that's a pile of shit. Everybody runs at Cleveland. Okay, you know, that's correct. You know, so at that time I started messing around porting my cylinder head. And one day I was running out there by Santa Monica Boulevard, a little bit past Sunset from Silver Lake, and a guy came up to me in a Ford Torino as well. And we were at the stoplight, he pulled up beside me, and I go, oh boy, there's gonna be a race. And when the light turned green, I was on it. I put 2 cars on him with his Cleveland. He could not believe it. And you know, and I had to explain to him, I think because you have the 2-barrel head, and then when I look in there, yeah, I had the 2V stamp, and it's an open chamber. They don't have the Australian heads at that time being sold out here. Okay, this is well, late 70s, early 80s. But anyway, the guy lost to me, and he couldn't believe it. He goes, I thought everybody said the Cleveland was so and so, and the Windsor is a pile of poop. I go, yeah, I agree, but I messed with mine. So when you figured, and I've always explained the importance of combustion chamber, the 2V didn't have a combustion chamber worth a damn. The 2V or 4V Windsor has a pretty good combustion chamber at that time as well. So when you got a superior burn as opposed to a more flowing cylinder head, you're gonna win with a better burning chamber because you utilize your fuel. All right, your combustion efficiency is so much more better, and more air really couldn't quite make it if it's not combusting properly. It has a weak ignition burn or thrust or expansion, and you're not going to get the power. That said, everybody then ran in Cleveland, and you know, it's amazing how I noticed fairly on that the Cleveland has an issue with the bottom end, because there are some fast cars back then, the street race and the racetrack. These doggone Clevelands would make power, all right. And I remember the large 71 or 72 Boss 351. They had a couple of them at the track, and 170 Boss 302 in Van Nuys at that time, and they were strong. They were running on the motor. They're not even running any squeeze, and just about everybody's running the bottle. These guys are superior on the motor. And I seen that once Boss 302 ran at Orange County back then. This is early 80s, 81, 82. And doggone, they went 1060. Okay, full body. And I was like blown away. And he used to street race everybody and run everybody on the motor. Okay, so here we go. Early on, the Boss 302 was the right direction, except it has the short deck. The 351 Windsor had the correct deck, but it has a shitty cylinder head. Excuse me. Today it's a different story. Everybody wants to build and buy a Windsor head. Back then we didn't have that option. The 69 casting was all we got. All right, and you really got to do a lot of massaging. And I won the Muscle Car Nationals with that configuration, a 69 70 C9 casting, and I was able to make decent power enough to win. And that's when the head start class started to begin. Anyway, so I did race a 351 Windsor powered 67 Mustang, and I give my friends a ride around the block with that car. You know, it's a consistent 1070, 1060, and it did a best of 1020. Of course, it's on nitrous at that time, and a heavy ass FMX transmission, like having two engines in front there, you know, with the cast iron FMX. I bet you if I had a C4 then it probably freed me up with power, plus the lesser weight probably would have cut another 2/10 off. and it's amazing I had a champ converter in it. But comparing the Windsor, even in ported form, there is just no way it'll keep up with a stock 351 Cleveland. Stock 351 Cleveland would probably flow about 270, 280. That's pretty much what I've seen through the years. And on the exhaust, they'll do a 1.9 under 200, compared to a Ford Windsor, especially with the horrendous exhaust port with a dog leg sticking out on the active part of the port, the roof. I think that probably flows 120 or 130, whereas a small block Chevy would probably flow about 140 or 10 under 150 stock. Still better than the Windsor, but they don't compare to almost 200 or 190 on a Cleveland. And on the intake port, the Windsor, it's probably choked up worse than what do you call that, the small block Chevy. The small block Chevy will flow about 205, and of course under 150. The Ford Windsor, or 289, whatever, hypo 289. That was a joke. They all had this better spring cup for the valve spring there on the head, but the port and everything is the same doggone thing. You know, a choked up intake port, exhaust port tiny, and I think they flow somewhere around 130. Even in ported form, I don't think it'll get to 180 or 170. I've put bushings on my the push rod bend on the start of the port, intake port. I shove some bushings in there and re-drilled it, so I have a more straight port, better than the Chevrolet. But I don't think it flowed any better than the Chevrolet, because when you have a Chevy with 202 valve, and I only could put a 194 in there, valve size sometimes determines the flow potential, because at that time everybody was a low port intake, and there's no way in the world I can flow 200 okay, with a 351 Windsor. Chevy, sure. Okay, I'm saying stock form. Ported, I don't know, maybe 230, 220 on the Windsor, and you can get to 245, 250 on a small block Chevy ported. Some probably got better. Maybe they did the same thing, but the 202, 160 as opposed to 145 for a 302 Windsor, or a 154 and then a 184, it's not going to compare. All right. So therefore, the Cleveland is there. All right. The potential. When you look at everything apples to apples, similar, compression ratio, you're probably looking at 30 horsepower. All right, or maybe a little bit more difference between the Ford and the Chevys. And therefore, that's why eventually, whatever they did for NHI or Pro Stock, they just said the only way we can beat that Cleveland is to run a captain valve, basically the big block Chevy, and that's when the history and all the innovation and moving the ports around started. All right, and then besides the left and right side port, the biggest back draw to the big block Chevy, of course, get a bigger bore. The combustion chamber is just huge, 120 plus or something like that. All right, and the Cleveland, when you mill it down, you can get down to the low 60s or maybe the 50s. Therefore, and like I said before, when I first dealt with the Yates head, I stayed away purposely away from the flow bench. This guy right here, because I know once you see the flow number, you start carving and trying to get more and more and more. Sometimes it's too much; it starts to drop and go backwards. Anyway, the first Yates that I had looked like this. It was very much a raw casting. You have to make your own intake, exhaust, and combustion chambers. Lots of work. Everything was raw. So I did the best I could from what I see. And this is now a high port intake and exhaust. The Yates C3H is a spin-off of the Cleveland because it's been penalized so much among the Racing Association that they just came up with a clean sheet of paper using the same head bolt pattern and cylinder head gasket layout and came up with the Yates. In fact, as opposed to back in the old days and today's combustion chamber is tiny, 30, 40, 45 probably big enough. Like I said, I ran 930s with this car at about 2,800 pounds. I don't even have a K-frame in my Fox body. And then the doggone thing, I expected, a 340, 360 CFM to have gone that fast. 750 horse, 800 horse. It only flowed 283 to be exact, and it's called 285 because it sounds better. All right, but what surprised me then was the CFM wasn't there. That's a street level, CFM rating on the head. When you look at the Cleveland, 280, 275, 280 is right there, and that's not even ported. All right, but of course, you're looking at a high port Yates and with a compact chamber, but that's the rage today. Fast burn chambers and high port intake angle, and of course, same thing with exhaust. All right, so that's a quick rundown, and the Cleveland just dominated because of the sheer size of it all back then, and then there's just no way you can make that up. Right? In fact, the 302 and the Boss 302, the Boss 351, the Boss 302 and the DZ Z28 302, I think the Boss 302 was 30 up. All right. In fact, the stock, I think 10.5 versus 11:1, and a much bigger, what was it, 220 or 230 on the Boss 302, and the 250 plus on the Z28, the Duntub cam, and that's a big difference, 20, 30 degrees more, and the Boss 302 I think pumped up 20, 25 more horsepower with half a point of compression. If you take the compression ratio of 30 per point, just say you add another 15 in that doggone thing, so now you're up about 35, 40 horsepower, everything being even. But of course, you don't gain everything for free. You pay for it someplace. The Boss 302 had a very soft mid-range. That's why in the Trans Am races, the big tracks, the Boss 302 dominated, and then on the shorter track, the Z28 dominated. Of course, right? Tip off, instant power. Sometimes a car that might have a little bit less power on the top end, but has a tip-in performance. It'll beat the higher horsepower combination with a big, humongous port that is lazy. When you tap the Boss 302, it'll latch real hard. But the doggone thing is that on the mid-range, it just doesn't have any port velocity, and port recovery is probably almost non-existent for such a small displacement. And you're gonna be down on the mid range, but the initial, because the big port's like a pocket full of fuel and air, all right. As soon as you go full throttle, the valve opens up. That's a big reservoir, so you have this instantaneous wah, and then it kind of like flattens out. Boss 302, Boss 351. Oh, but anyway, my train of thought. So like I said, my 67 Mustang ran 1020, eventually 1060. But my street car that I gave everybody a ride, in fact, even my girlfriend back then, I scared the dog snot out of her. I'd leave the line at 7,500. I had a 4-speed top loader with 514 gears on the back. And stoplight to stoplight, oh my God, what big intake port. When you have big headers, high RPM, and I had a 260 at 50 solid roller cam in it, and I think 640 on a 110 crane cam back then. All right, and that was on my street car, and I had a strip dominator manifold. That doggone thing just scared the bejesus out of everybody. And every time I hit second gear, the glove box would slide out, and the glove box would open up, and the, what do you call that, the ashtray it'll come out of the center console, and it seemed like it'll bust the windshield. Okay, because I'm floored, and I sidestep the clutch, and I pull second, and then same thing with third, and you go boom, boom, boom. You feel it in your chest when you're inside the car. In fact, also when you see a Boss 351 or a Boss 302 launch at the racetrack at 4-speed, super stock, or just like those guys at the street is back then, stand behind it while you're going down the street or a racetrack, and boom, boom. It's just freaking amazing. All right, that's why I gotta finish my Boss, my 70 Mach 1, because I'd like to do that shit again, but now I'm gonna stroke it to 408. So now it's gonna be a baby big block Chevy. Okay, so that's a little story. But anyway, let's get started with this doggone. I have 2V US head, 2V Australian head, 4V US head, and I had a port plate pro stock head right here, which is even kind of sad. It's a Boss 302 head. Man, I could have restored that, but it is. Right, so the 2V thing and the Australian head is what I prefer on the street right now for street level RPMs. Here we go. Here we are with the Cleveland heads here, and I have 4 here. You have the US 2-barrel open chamber, Australian 2-barrel closed chamber 4V US, and of course a much modified pro stock style Cleveland head. So here's the crazy part about this thing is that this too, even though this is from Australia, this is the US, this place is about 170cc intake port volume. That's pretty healthy, okay? Because you can buy aftermarket heads right now, 165, 170, 180, or 185 from a lot of the manufacturers. This 170cc that came from the factory, that's pretty doggone healthy, I feel. And I've done some where this fits the 2-barrel port on a 302. You can make yourself a wannabe Boss 302, but I would prefer to use the Australian head because the combustion chamber is close, not like this one here, which I'll show later on. Now, this one flows about 215 at 28. That's pretty good compared to, factory Z28 or factory Chevy head, typical, about 205, 210 CFM, compared to the 351 Windsor, which is about 180. It's choked up, all right? And I've seen it as low as 160, okay, for the 289, 302 HO heads, so there's a big difference. This thing definitely makes more power. Same thing with Australian head. It also flows about 215. It's amazing. but now you have the better combustion chamber. So there's a better. If anybody here like to build, you know, a Boss 302 type clone, use the Australian head. Perfect fit. All right, because you don't have to really swap pistons. The way this is with a smaller chamber and a closed chamber layout, it's basically a bolt-on to a 302, and you can have yourself a you know, a wannabe Boss 302. But if you want to put some compression in it, again, this one will require less dome than that. Now, 4-barrel Cleveland head. That is 170 cc for these two guys. This is 242 cc. That is big. All right. Considering when you look at the TFS, AFR, they provide 220, you know, 200 cc, 242 from the factory. That's amazing. Now, the crazy part is TFS would offer a CNC ported 240 cc high pour or twisted wedge. That is as cast. All right. So there are a lot of dead zones in it. Of course, it's old style technology. It's not quite as advanced as we have today. And here is the Pro Stock head, and we'll talk about this. Now, when it's ported, like here, 330 is typically what you get. When you start raising the port roof a bit, you could probably get up to 355, okay, and change to a 52-degree seat or 50, get a little bit more CFM. And of course, when you epoxy the floor, but I prefer the ones that there's a spacer that somebody sells out there, an aluminum spacer, you stick it in here and then you drill it, and that fills in the bottom part of the roof. And by the time you raise the roof a bit, and then epoxy, or if you have money, weld that, you know, you can get up to 350, okay, 355, maybe 360, maybe, all right? But it requires filling the floor. I use A and B epoxy 2-part. Here's the part number or the name, and make sure that's what you use. But remember, always when you mix this 2-part epoxy, the trick is get a wet rag beside you, keep it there, and keep dabbing your hand on the wet rag while you knead the 2-part epoxy. Keep it mixed, because if your hands are dry and you mix it, guess what? The epoxy is on your skin, not on here. All right. So a little wet rag, do this, and keep your hands moist. Then by the time you're mixing the 2-part epoxy, or any epoxy for the matter, it doesn't stick to your hand, to your palm and stuff, and really mess up, and you're not going to accomplish very much. All right. Now where do I? Okay. So here we are. Well, actually, let me rephrase this. This is actually a Boss 302. All right. It's the 69 one. Now, they come with a 224. That's big, right? And when you look at the Cleveland's 219, 224, 69, 70 went down to 219. That's a 302 with as much intake valve as a big block Chevrolet. Same thing on the exhaust, 1.7. Wow. That's why you kind of figured this doggone thing is dominate, just because the intake port is just so massive. Okay, back then, the prevailing thought was flow, flow, flow. They really didn't think much about, you know, swirl, tumble, and combustion chamber. Well, the racers probably did. You know, Glidden, Roush, and all, Reher Morrison, they've done enough. Okay, angle milling the combustion chamber. I mean the surface of the head, just to get it to adapt. In fact, later on, I'll bring a Pro Stock big block Chev here, comparable to this and what they did. Anyway, so that being said, it is quite remarkable the power they made back then. That's cast iron, okay? And the combustion chamber is pretty good. You cannot beat a standard. No, okay, let me rephrase this. Back then, a lot of them that were racing decided that Jenkins Morrison, Rare Morrison, all that. There's no way in the world that you can race and be competitive with a canted valve head like here. Okay, the Cleveland is the only canted valve head for a small block. That's production, factory, from the manufacturer. And when you think you can keep up, well, I had that experience before. I was racing another renowned engine builder, and he runs an inline Chevy head against my so-called Cleveland derivative, which was a Blue Thunder. Right off the get-go, they're way lighter than we are, okay? And we're still able to run as fast as they do with a lot heavier weight. That to me was indicative of what these guys went through back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, more 70s and 80s. This Cleveland's, because of the superior intake port, okay, made more power per cubic inch. Therefore, NASCAR, NHRA especially, strapped in with added weight per cubic inch. So when you see this doggone Pinto go up against a big block Camaro, the Pinto weighed more per cubic inch than the big block Chevy or whatever. They could have the AMC and all that. This doggone thing was penalized with a lot more weight. So eventually a lot of them, like Jack Roush, came up with the Tijuana Taxi. It's a 4-door Maverick. They were able to circumvent the added weight penalty for anybody running the Cleveland head. And another very well-known Chevy racer ended up running a Cleveland on his Corvette. Again, because it said Ford body style. That indicated, of course, a Ford engine. But he was running in competition eliminator. He put a Cleveland in his Corvette and got away from the weight penalty. Because the weight penalty was applied on the Corvette, not on the engine. So he was able to put whatever engine, which was a Cleveland, and that's what he ran, and was very successful. So this thing was politicized to the point that there were restrictors added to them later on, just all sorts of stuff. NASCAR, okay, that's why NASCARs are running restrictor plates. All right, they're basically were 750 went down to what was that, 390 CFM with restrictors. It's horrible. It's like a 2-barrel. All in effect because at that time when these guys were running out of castings, Elliott and them guys, Robert Yates came up with the Yates head, which was a deeper breeding version of the Cleveland, or an updated version of the Cleveland, which I experienced many years ago as well, on how the doggone combustion chamber was part of the whole scenario. Now, that said, they ended up with restrictor plates to slow down the Yates combination, because at that point in time they were just flat out running away, and Bill Elliott and all them guys did 212 mile an hour super speedway record that still stands until today. And it was somebody else out there also running. Kel Yarborough was also the one only able to catch up and break away from the draft and chase down Bill Elliott's Thunderbird. Whatever, Elliott and the number 9 T-Bird, and Kel Yarborough's in the 28 Hardee's Ford Thunderbird. One of those guys, okay, were running the derivative of the new Yates heads, and they were flat out kicking butt. And the whole contingent made a complaint, and that's when the restrictors, after the Bobby Allison crash as well, gave that. And then the glass back Monte Carlo was allowed, as long as they built 500 of them, because the Monte Carlo just couldn't quite keep up. Again, we're looking at because of the cylinder head. All right, that's what makes a top-end power. So these engines were severely punished, or the cylinder head was severely punished, and I will show later on the advantages, disadvantages, because I happen to have a pro stock big block Chevy head here, that we're going to compare to this Pro Stock style small block, and what was the difference. Okay, here we are with the Cleveland exhaust ports. There's the 2-barrel cylinder head. There's an Aussie 2V, and there's a 4V US, and a port-plated Pro Stock style cylinder head right here. Now, when we look at this thing here, I think this got a 1.650 exhaust valve in it, and this one here has got a 1.7. Amazing how the Australians knew that the exhaust port is somewhat lacking, so they helped it out with a bigger, slightly bigger exhaust valve. And this one flows 165 roughly stock. This one you get to 190 stock as well. So this has a little bit more potential, and I'm sure it will show some kind of power dividend when you have a better exhaust port. Even though horsepower calculations taking intake flow, calculating that, all right, more than exhaust. They don't combine intake and exhaust flow. And always look at the potential of a cylinder head, just the intake flow by itself. Because, well, if we make it a little bit more detailed, overlap plays a big part in the port recovery and yanking the intake column into the combustion chamber. Overlap does a lot of that to a big extent, and it has a major effect on how that cylinder head performs. But calculation is always done with just intake port flow, not a combination of both. So we'll take it up that. So here we go. And when you look at the 4-barrel head, look how big the exhaust ports are. Just the sheer difference. But that does not tell you the whole story, because it's got a real bad dog leg. It comes out and then dives right in because of the shock tower. With the Ford vehicles at that time, the 69, you know, the 68, 70, shock towers right in front of the exhaust manifold, so they basically, you know, did the exhaust port like that to fit it inside the engine compartment. I think that was a mistake, but that's what they knew at that time. And here you are, when you glob off a big portion of the exhaust port and put aluminum plates. And this one here, well, this one here flows about 190, okay, stock. So that's pretty good. That's approaching 200. This one here, about 245. Big, lot more potential. It's comparable with today's modern heads, this one here. Okay, so it just shows to you what good stuff they were able to devise at that time in the 70s and the 80s, having the port plates. And this one here, even though this is real bad, it will still outdo most cylinder heads from the factory. Alright? The velocity is not there, no doubt, because it's such a big port that when the valve opens up, it sees that big opening, it kind of tends to slow down. Just like the hose, you know. When you open up the hose and then you restrict the tip of the hose, it shoots faster, or the velocity of the water coming out picks up quite a bit. Alright? So there is indeed an effect there. Top end, full power, I don't doubt it. It probably works. It should work, but some put tongue plates right here on the exhaust port floor. That seemed to help very much. And there should be power there. You know, people say, you know, 20, 25 horse. It depends. Now, with this port plate, this is actually small. Alright, so I think this was probably a road racing cylinder head at that time, because they didn't do anything radical with the intake port. So it looked like from this point on, it looked like they're after exhaust velocity here, which has an effect on how effective the yanking pull, your overlap, and that's reflected on the intake port and yanks the air column in. That plays a factor. Now, when you do this exhaust port plate like this, you can actually widen the lobe center on the engine. Okay, because I talked about this on my other video before, where when the exhaust port is improved, and then when the intake port is you put those tongue plates we talk about that bolts up to the port floor. That basically raises the intake port floor, makes the engine think it's got a high port or a higher port angle. Plus they start welding or epoxying the port roof. So now the exhaust to intake relation, your overlap, is exaggerated by a whole lot, because now the intake port reacts quicker. It doesn't have to come in and go up with the bump and then come down. Now it's at a higher port angle, and then the exhaust also, it doesn't have this port coming out and then dives out, all right, which is indicative of here. It wants to dive down. When you put those port plates, it tends to give it a ramp to come up to. Instead of having this downfall, it'll do this, it'll nose dive. Now you put that ramp, come up, all right? So it helps, especially on the 4V head. And then that little port floor mismatch to the header is actually a reversion down, okay? Because when the port comes up and wants to come back during reversion, that tongue plate, or not tongue plate, but exhaust port plate, have a tendency to act like it's a stop, like a speed bump. All right, so the reflected wave coming back during overlap will be stopped by that exhaust port plate. So all in all, not only did you help flow, but also you help the reversion aspect of the whole dynamics of the cylinder head. We get back with the exhaust port. When I know that it's huge, okay? Even on a 302 or a 351, they still outdo the small block Chrysler and the small block Chevy, stock to stock, with everything being even, because of the mass flow difference. 200, low 200s, 205 on the small block Chevy. This doggone thing is flowing about 275 stock. That is a whole lot of flow difference. Even with the exhaust port, as bad as it is, but at high RPM, it starts to flow. It's right in its element. Like I said, high RPM, not low RPM. But low RPM with such a big port, when the valve opens up and sees that big exhaust port, instead of shooting out like on a Chevy or even the choked up Windsor, but the Chrysler, they see that and they proceed to go downstream to the collector. With such a big port like that, valve opens up, sees it, and instead of accelerating out downstream to the collector, it tends to slow it down. Too much opening, all right? Too much opening. Here, it's just perfect, all right? So I think we got a pretty good description here. And now let's move to the combustion chamber. Okay, combustion chamber side. Open chamber, the worst situation you have, but I'll make one exception, I'll comment later on. The Australians did a real good job. If you look at this thing, they mimic the 4V combustion chamber and use the very good for street type situation intake port. Intake port volume between the two Aussie and the American two barrel heads are the same, and also they flow somewhat the same, okay? And anyway, when you look at the combustion chamber, see this? It's detonation prone. This is nice, and of course this rework here has got a 219 intake valve. This is also 219, so this probably has 70 Boss 302. Now there's a difference here. The Boss 302 has an extra bolt around here beside the valve cover rail, and it's right here on this picture. When you look at the 351 Cleveland, there's one way of finding out if this is a Boss head, Boss 302 or not. This bolt hole here signifies as a Boss 302 cylinder head. This is a Cleveland or even a Boss 351. So when somebody tells you, oh, we got an original Boss 302, and it doesn't have that little gizmo right there for the alternator, it is not a Boss 302 head. All right? That is the difference between a Cleveland head and a Boss 302. You won't have that bolt hole there. The combustion chamber is very effective, and like I said, for years ago, when I ran my Ranchero, I had flat top pistons, which I think equate to 10.7 10.5, and then I went over to the open chamber heads, trying to, this is 30, 35 years ago, thinking that I could reduce the chance of detonation when I'm pulling my race car up the hill there. With the lower compression, I actually detonated worse. All right. Not only was my response inferior, it didn't have the torque, the tip and power. It detonated like mad. And on one of my videos, I did highlight that. Okay, on how much compression you can run on the street, part 1 and part 2. I talk about this very thing here, how the quench tend to, when the flame front's opening up, start to expand, and the piston's coming up, 5 degrees and 5 degrees after top dead center, when the flame is expanding rapidly. Here you don't have anything, no speed bumps. These are basically speed bumps. When the flow is when the ignition sphere is initiated and ignition starts, it wants to accelerate, all right, to an explosion. When it starts to accelerate, because right now the piston's coming up, okay, pressure's coming up, temperature's coming up, it wants to auto-ignite, and at the same time go to an explosion. This acts like a speed bump. It kind of like limit the speed and slow it down. Here, there's nothing to do that. It'll keep accelerating because there's no dam or no speed bump or flow. Well, ignition front speed bump, nothing. That's the right word I can do. All right, so here it is. This is the situation with that. If you look at the intake ports, they're all symmetrical, and that's what made this an impressive cylinder head even back in the day. All right, so let's proceed on. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful to everybody planning on building a Cleveland or a Boss 302 clone. Just it doesn't take much of a rocket scientist to do that. Just good selection of parts. But let me give you some tips here. If you want to do a Boss 302 clone, run the Australian head, so that if you can get a Cleveland style piston, or for example custom made piston, it doesn't require that much of a dome. Okay, maybe a slight dome will give you 11.5 to 1 or 11 to 1 for the street, and the perfect, just right amount of port volume will work real good. And tell you what, you can keep it simple. You could probably put in there a E-cam with a 1.7 rocker, or a B-cam with a 1.7 rocker. I'm trying to lift this a little higher, or an F-cam. Any one of those alphabet camshaft will pretty much work. And then when you put it together, and if the car's somewhat on the heavy side, just advance the cam a little bit. 2 to 4 degrees is a lot. Still doing July 4th fireworks over here, but do that. Or you could get stocking pistons for Cleveland's today from Ross, Molly. I think they still stock some replacement type piston, but perhaps a little higher compression, 10.5 to 1, 11 to 1. But here's the best thing that I would recommend. You heard about the tongue plates, and like Tim Haas is showing, the intake port plates that bolt onto the floor. All that is great. Gives you 25, 30 foot-pounds of torque, or whatever they're worth. I guess everything's different. There are variations in how much you get. Wow, these guys are still going for it. But tell you this, all that is nice, but it costs money. When you do the tongue plates on the intake, now you got to do something on your manifold. Right? You probably have to extend an epoxy in there so that it doesn't hit that wall when you raise the port or the port floor. From my experience, I tell you what, if you build a 400 stroker Cleveland, or better yet, if you have a Windsor and you take it up to stock bores 40, 60 over with a 4 170 stroke or 4 100 stroke, there's no need for those tongue plates, you're not going to miss that 30 foot-pounds of torque because you're going to have a lot of torque. Okay, and I've done several already. 431 or was it 432 with a Cleveland 4-barrel closed chamber. They pull hard. Okay, is it too much intake port? Not that cubic inch. And then the engine weighs about 500 pounds with a stock block, or 480 pounds stock factory block, 351 Windsor or Cleveland. You stroke the Cleveland to what do they have, a 393 or a 398, something like that. But I'd go for the 408 kit. And on the 351 build, I'll run a 4100 stroke over a 4-inch stroke, or in fact better yet 4170. What you're going to find out, you're going to have lots of torque. There's no need for exhaust port plates or tongue plates or those intake port plates to raise the floor. Not really needed. Okay, the engine's going to be light. It doesn't weigh 850 pounds. A big block trans. You're still going to be on a C4 if that, or I prefer a turbo 350 on the street with a bell housing to mount to the Ford. So, you know, because anytime I get down to the low nines, the C4 just starts to puke. Maybe because I just turned too much RPM. All right, it's never worked for me. So I just elected to run a turbo 350 on my street car and on the race car as well. Boy, that's a big one. Another one. So I tell you what, a 432 cubic inch Cleveland headed 4V. All right. You're going to be very, very good. Now on the Australian head, a 347 stroker, perfect. Okay. In fact, maybe just find some Boss 302 type nostalgia pistons in there. I don't know if they're still around, but if you have it custom made, I tell you what, it's worth it. Australian head, ported. Okay. There's no need for a tongue plate on the intake or a to raise the floor. The port volume is just right. Open it up to 185, 190, perfect. 11.5 to 1 with a hydraulic cam, alphabet cam from Ford Motorsport, keeping the budget down. Use that on a HL block. You got something going. You can easily make 500 horsepower with that. Okay, 400 with the, maybe with the mild camshaft from Ford Motorsport. Easy, 450, 400, oh yeah. Okay, now when you go with a hydraulic, a solid roller, okay, with 11.5 to 1 custom pistons, metric ring pack, okay, now you got something going. So, now for the manifolds, if you end up with a 9.5 deck, Cleveland head combination, you can buy those spacers from Ford Motorsport. In fact, I make some of them too that I'll post there pretty soon, and adapt a 9.2 deck intake manifold to a 9.5 Windsor block. That is easily done. Any competitive or competent machine shop can do that for you. All right, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to. It's just a real thin plate and adapt that and convert that to a front exit and run the TFS thermostat adapter. You're good. All right, so it's not going to be expensive. I tell you what, I'm in love with that valve cover from Moroso, if you do a nostalgia thing. Okay, and a Boss 302 clone. I've done one not that long ago. I hope the guy passed away. His daughter owns it now, and boy, that was an Australian head. And I had some custom pistons for 11.5 to 1. Oh, last advice. If you really want to make it look like a real Boss 302, then put that little hole and mount your alternators as such. Okay? Because that differentiates the Boss 302 from the 4V and the 2V. Cleveland's. Alright? And the 2V, there's a tag 2 on the ends of the cylinder head, and of course the 4-barrel, there's 4. It's just, you can't tell a closed chamber from an open chamber 4V head. But if you want to do a clone boss trail too, drill that little holes to make it look like it's real. And you got to take off that 4 because the boss trail too doesn't have a tag 4 on the end of it. Okay. Anyway, please please subscribe, like, share, and comment so I can keep this going. All right, guys. You guys take care. Happy 4th of July. Here we are with the two competitors back then. When you look at the big block Chevy, it's got a much bigger combustion chamber to the Cleveland. Of course, it's a big block that they stroke, and there's a small block that they also stroke. But having the bigger combustion chamber creates a lot of thermal losses because the heat of combustion that makes power is not retained and spread on a much bigger area. So it gets cooled down quicker. Your thermal efficiency is not as good. Here it's more effective. And here you go. See, the one port goes there, straight to that area. This one comes in and slides to the exhaust valve. So these are two different port lengths. They're doing two different things. They'll peak at 2 different RPM. On the Cleveland, it's the same. All right, symmetrical. Some new big block Chevy heads today are symmetrical in port layout. They don't have this too. So the biggest drawback there is this big combustion chamber as opposed to compact chamber, and of course the exhaust port that's port plated. And when you look at this, it's welded. The exhaust port used to end up here, and the exhaust port used to be here. All right, so that's a plate, and this is welded. You can see right there a plate, and you can see right there how much it's been welded, quite a bit. Intake port, I don't have the valves for these anymore on the big block, so I don't know how much it actually flowed. I should have kept them before, but look at the epoxy on the floor. Okay, you can pretty much see the difference there. And a tremendous amount of welding, none here. I think there's more like maybe a road racing or a circle track. But look at all the welding there. Oh, some July 4th festivities. All the welding to raise the port, and here there's none. Alright, so you already see the two competitors back in the day.